as part of its PopChange Salon series, which explores how the power of pop culture can shift how people see, think, and feel about migration and displacement. We're grateful to now play this festival and Somerset House in London for hosting us today. So the question I have, and we all have, is how do games change our understanding of what it means to be a refugee? In this panel, we'll explore this topic using displacement as our guiding theme. We're going to begin by sharing our projects, and then we're going to converse on number one, how do lived experiences get incorporated into games? Number two, what kind of games build empathy around refugees? Number three is funding. And number four is stories of displacement that we're not seeing in games yet. And I guess if you have some ideas for that or some questions at the end, we'll have some time for this too. So it is my honor to introduce, in order of given name, Florent Morin. Him was a journalist before he created the Pixel Hunt, a video game studio with a focus on reality-inspired games. In 2017, the Pixel Hunt launched its first independent game about a Syrian refugee trying to find her way to Europe, the critically acclaimed Bury Me, My Love. They are soon launching their upcoming game, Wreck, a 3D visual novel about sisterhood, motherhood, grief, and survival. Malath Abbas, him, is a game designer, artist, and creative producer who has been working on experimental and meaningful games and experiences in Scotland and internationally for over 10 years. He is a founding member of Biome Collective, a creative studio, community, and digital space. Malath is currently creating Hope based on his own journey as a refugee who settled in the UK. The interactive experience explores different aspects of identity using a unique Middle Eastern futurism visual and sonic aesthetic. And Cindy Bashani, her, is a multidisciplinary designer and writer based in London. Her projects have been shown at Tate Britain, Somerset House, V&A Museum of Childhood, and Indiecade Festival. She developed Dictatura, a VR docu-game based on true accounts from individuals who experienced the Albanian dictatorship. Cindy is a co-founder of Episode, which is currently developing the docu-game Race for the Arctic, a game built together with scientists and indigenous communities. Page down. I'm Jennifer Estaris, her. I'm game director at ustwo Games, a B Corp known for Monument Valley and Alba Wildlife Adventure. I was previously at Cybo, known for Subway Surfers, Disney, Nickelodeon, and I was raised in Atlanta as a first-generation immigrant, Filipina immigrant. I'm active in UNEP's Playing for the Planet, the IGA Climate SIG, and Extinction Rebellion, and a mom to a lovely 8-year-old who was in the audience, but is somewhere, there's right behind me. So we'll begin with past work and future questions. Each person is going to share specific examples from their own work, framing some of the key questions and challenges we're going to talk about today. Let's begin with Malath. Hello.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Great to be part of this conversation. Happy to kind of kick off with the project I'm working on myself. A project called Hope. You can see some visuals here in the background. You see the word ML for hope there. And if you go to the next slide there, you can see the kind of visual inspirations for the project. I come from Iraq in the Middle East. I was brought up in Baghdad, my home, and we left after the first Gulf War in 91. So we settled in the UK many, many years ago, became a naturalized British citizen in my kind of early teens. And especially during that time, my early teens of seeking identity, trying to figure out who I was, it was quite a difficult period of my life in the sense that I became two separate people. I was one person at home, the Arab me, and the British Scouse me who was going to school. Anyway, fast forward nearly 20 years of education and working in the games industry. I finally had the skills in terms of production and design to explore my own narrative, my own journey. I think part of that was probably becoming a father, quite recently. Part of that desire to kind of tell your own story. So I applied for funding from Creative Scotland, which is the arts body in Scotland. It was particularly a part of funding for marginalized voices in the art world. So I applied for Hope, and Hope essentially is me attempting to document and share my own journey as a refugee, as a child refugee with my parents, and also that journey of settling into a different country, trying to understand who you are as a world citizen, because I grew up very much in the kind of framework of being a world citizen. I kind of grown up with a quote that says, you know, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. And that kind of global view isn't necessarily shared by everyone for different reasons. So I wanted to kind of express a project that maybe shows the pain involved in that kind of, you know, being a refugee, but also the kind of the hope and love and care that's part of that process too. And as you can see in the first slide, it's got very abstract visuals, even though I've got this interesting aesthetic I'm trying to explore, which is pretty much Middle Eastern, Islamic art, that kind of background. But I'm also trying to tell a quite a tough subject matter. So I'm going through quite a journey of abstracting a lot of the visuals. So yeah, there's a project I'm currently working on, which I hope I'll be able to share more of in the year ahead.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And I really love what you said about being a world citizen and portraying it and communicating with the world that way. There's, I can't remember the exact quote by Michael Onjate about the sadness of geography, but it is true that, oh, we've lost, oh, there we go. Yes. I'll move on to Cindy Bashani to share her work.
Can you hear me now? Okay, that's good. Hi, everyone, again. I think there's going to be some images, I guess. But yes, so my journey in video games is a bit, I didn't start as a game designer. I studied design at Goldsmiths University and then Royal College of Art. I studied information experience design, which looks at how can we use design to turn information into experiences. And for me, I found games as the best medium to tell stories and to turn information into experience. Because on one hand, we have the way that we build the world inside the game and we tell stories, but then on the other, it's the player experience. And I started by wanting to tell stories about truth and democracy, which is inspired by my upbringing in Albania and the stories of the Albanian dictatorship. And that's what kind of made Dictatura. And then I started Episode Studio with a theme that we want to build games that tell true stories and inspire audiences. And the game we're working on now is Race for the Arctic. And the process we're taking is that, and I kind of, it starts with curiosity because the Arctic is so far from us, from our studio, from our team. And I want the game to be a platform for the people who are closest to the story. So we start by interviewing scientists, indigenous communities, and our goal is to interview 15 to 21. And right now we've interviewed around 10. And these are some of the interviews we've done, which is starting from Dr. Liviu, who is an astronomer in the northernmost telescope in the world, to Tomasia, he's an Inuit game designer who launched a board game on a Kickstarter recently, to Dr. Chris Brown, who is an expert in permafrost, and his history is about, he was sent by the Canadian government to research about oil pipelines, but then he fell in love with a woman from the indigenous communities, and then he decided to just become an activist and talk about permafrost and climate change. And when we interview them, we then follow a participatory design process, which continues into a creative workshop, and then we implement it in the game. So for me, I see my role as a game designer just as a facilitator. So I am the one in between the people whose stories we need to hear and the players who need to hear the stories. Yes, this is the process we follow. And we kind of use this process also in Dictatura. So we interviewed people who lived during the Albanian dictatorship. And then we collect, in the workshop, we collect drawings and testimonies. And then we work on implementation in the game. And then we always go back to our collaborators to make sure that everything, because it's this process, like we need to make sure it's very ethical and it's very transparent and everything they say is very well represented in the game. And this is a screenshot from the workshop we did with Professor Roberto Herman. He's a professor of green shipping in Norway. And here we were kind of pointing out where are the key ports in the Northern Sea route. And this is a concept art for our game, which is a logbook, because in the game players are going to play 3 generations of a fictional freight family. And all the stories are going to be collected in this logbook, and players are going to sail the ship around the Arctic, and they're going to collect entries. And each entry is going to open one scene in the Arctic, which I think is another picture. Yeah, sometimes they're going to scan with binoculars, sometimes they're going to sail the ship around the Arctic. And we want all these different logbook entries to be built with one collaborator. And sometimes the collaborators are going to feature as secondary characters. Sometimes they're going to inspire the story. Sometimes we want, for example, now we're going to work with Tomasia because he's a graphic designer as well. We want him to draw the scenes in the game. So there's different ways for our collaborators to be part of the game. I think that's it. Okay. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I'm really drawn to, especially the number of people that you have. It's almost like an authentic family, and the multiple stories that will be told through this. So looking forward to it. And then finally, Florent.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, properly?
Yes.
Yeah, it's really cool and funny because so my name is Florent Morin. I was a former journalist. I've been a journalist for 10 years before making games. Actually, I've kind of always wanted to make games, but it wasn't deemed a serious career path by my family, and I couldn't just jump the shark and get to it. And then I started seeing games pop up. It was probably 10 to 15 years ago, such as this one, Against All Odds, which was made by the UNHCR and was talking about a very serious topic, which is the topic of having to move from to leave your country because you're in danger and you have to find asylum in another country. And how does it feel and how does it looks like? And I played that game, and I was a fairly young journalist then, but it made its way. I thought to myself, this is a very powerful way to convey stories. And that's what I was doing for a living, like listening to people, trying to understand what they experienced, and trying to write texts, articles, and make videos about those stories in order for as many people to understand those stories and to just get the life experience of other people as possible. And then it made its way through my mind, and I thought to myself, this is video games are a very powerful medium, and maybe there's something to do there. So I quit my job as a journalist and I founded my company that is called The Pixel Hunt, and that's basically a video game studio, but with a focus on what we call reality-inspired games. And yes, we thought, what are the topics that we could talk about as an indie game studio? And we bumped into an article on a French newspaper, Le Monde, which was called The Journey of a Syrian Migrant as told by our WhatsApp conversations. And this was very, very powerful. It inspired us to get in touch with the person in the article, who is called Dana. And Dana, she's a Syrian young woman, and she left her country and tried to reach Europe. And she achieved that goal. She reached Germany, but lots of people didn't. So we got in touch with her, we listened to her, we listened to a lot of other people. And that's how we came up with the idea for Bury My Love. And while we were doing that, the UNHCR did another game called Finding Home that I think we can show. And we were working on Bury My Love at the time, and we saw that game, which was really pretty similar to what we tried to do, except it was way more fictional. And they did something differently than us. They decided to use real images. Well, actually, not real images, because the people you can see, if you can show the other images from the game, the people you can see in the game are actually actors and actresses, but they really try to mimic what it's like to be in touch with it's a GIF, so it was important as a series of images. So it's not gonna work, but anyway. So we tried we thought to ourselves, this is really interesting, but we tried to do something a little bit different with Bury My Love. we tried to go with a fictional work that would also tell a real story or several real stories, because when you make a game, you make choices and you can get in very different situations. So yeah, that's the images of Finding Home. So they tried to go for the real thing, and we didn't want to do that with Bury My Love. With Bury My Love, we tried to distance ourselves a little bit from the story we were saying, because even though we asked Dana a lot of questions, we ourselves were not refugees, and we didn't think it would be a good idea to be too close to reality using real pictures and moving images. So maybe we can show very quickly Bury My Love. So that's the game that we worked on, and it's an interactive story basically with a lot of different choices and paths you can go down, and everything that happens in the game is directly inspired by true story from migrants and refugees that we gathered either by interviewing them or by reading press and articles about them. And I think it's what is interesting with Bury My Love is that it tells the story of one main character, that is Noor, but it also tells the story of thousands of different people who experienced the stories of displacements and who told their story, and those stories are retold through our project. And no, I don't want to be too long, but there are also other games in the same area that are really cool, such as Path Out, that maybe we'll discuss a little bit later. But this is like, yeah, this is our game, Bury My Love. And that's it basically. Yeah, so this game is Path Out, and it's really cool because it's also been made by a Syrian refugee that is now living in Austria. And yeah, that's him, Abdullah. And what is really cool in this game is that you play the game and you play as a young Syrian migrant, and you try to cross the border, and then you get killed by soldiers. And then Abdullah appears on screen and says, "Oh, you had me killed. You should have been more careful." So it's really funny because he's experienced that. He's experienced the danger and the tension, but he's able to share his story in a very funny way. And I think that's one of the things we can discuss. It's important. The tone you put in those stories is important, and instantly you connect with him and you want to know more about his story. So you continue playing the game because every now and then in the game, there's little snippets of him talking face camera and telling more of his story. And you feel compelled to know more because you connect with him through the fact that his story is real, but also through the fact that he's joking about it and he's able to put some distance between what happened to him and how he delivers the story. And it's also a very, very cool, great game that I would encourage everybody to play.
Thank you so much, Florent. I mean, it's interesting how the distancing, but then also the metatizing, I don't know if there's a right word for that, with the corner responses, it made it more, for me anyway, it made it more personal, like and less stressful. Like I didn't worry because I knew I wasn't playing one person's story for Bury Me My Love, that I was any person's story. Excellent. Thank you all for sharing. I'll share quickly a bit on what we're working on and the reason why I'm taking notes throughout this session. So we can view the videos of it. Yeah, so ustwo Games is where I work. It's a small art house game studio in South London. We're most known for Monument Valley 1 and 2, and 1 and 2 is about impossibility in architecture. We created a new chapter in Monument Valley 2 called The Lost Forest, which you see here, which is about forest conservation. It was inspired by a talk by Peter Voloban, the author of Hidden Life of Trees, and we made it for the Playing for the Planet Game Jam. The chapter begins and ends with a call to action for players to sign a petition, and it was a Play for Forest petition called on World Leaders to Protect Forests, doubled the number of petition signatures, so it was excellent. We also have a game called Alba, a Wildlife Adventure, which is about how even the smallest person can make a difference. And for every download of the game, we plant a tree. And so far, we've planted over 1 million trees. So for the next Monument Valley, we are looking at themes of climate justice and climate resilience, and most relevant to today's panel, climate migration and displacement. So I am taking notes because I am learning from this esteemed group of panelists and want an opportunity today for this exploratory conversation. Thank you all for being here. So let's begin. Our first topic is incorporating lived experiences. How does a lived experience get incorporated into the game? So we've talked a little bit about it in your own personal projects, but I'd love to hear just even more, casually, personally, between each other. How does this happen? What are the nuances of this when talking about refugees' experiences? There are questions of like who owns the story and, ethics and privacy concerns. And I'd love to hear more. Malath, perhaps to begin?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Obviously with my project, it's very much it's my own story. But there's a complication to that process in the sense that it's very personal. It's not just my own story. It includes my family, my broader family. I mean, I left Iraq over 30 years ago, but in that spell of time, I've had other members of my family seek refuge, in different parts of the world. Even over the past few years, I've had family members in very precarious situations. So that's made it quite challenging for me because I have this kind of this weight on my shoulders about telling a story that's kind of authentic to me, but is broadly accessible when I'm thinking about other people. So that's been very tough for me, and also from a kind of because I'm a producer and a designer, wearing those two hats, the kind of producer in me managed to get the funding to make the project. The designer in me has to now express that project, in a design context. But the other side of me, the producer has to think about, well, who owns the story? Who's this for? I got arts funding, which means that I'm given an opportunity to experiment and tell quite an authentic story. But obviously, I'm making a product at the end of the day for people to consume, or an artwork for people to kind of an audience to be attracted to. So there's lots of kind of balancing there, or figuring out, how do you tell the truth in a palatable way? I think it's really interesting that a number of the points raised so far is how you make something palatable, because actually, dark subject matter like the fact that we have refugees on planet Earth is a horrible subject matter, and it's very tricky to kind of tell the horrors of that story, but in a way that doesn't alienate people and doesn't kind of make them turn away. So you have to get the balance just right. Which is very, very tricky, especially in my context where I'm having to kind of do a lot of soul searching, genuine soul searching in terms of what I can express, what I can't express, how I can express it. Because especially if it was with my take on this whole narrative is that I'm focusing a lot on kind of the racism I've experienced in the UK. I grew up in Liverpool, a city that I still I consider my home, a city that I love and adore. But I experienced, a horrible amount of racism just day to day, just being myself sort of thing. So I've had that to deal with, but then also being connected to my family and, in Iraq and other places who are quite frankly going through much worse situations than I was, so it puts the everyday racism to makes it quite minor. So it's a really tricky balancing act. But I do feel that we have a responsibility to tell these stories, specifically in games, because I feel that the games community is maybe underserved in terms of this kind of content. So I'm really glad that this panel, everyone here is trying to tell these stories, very uncomfortable stories.
And would you say that when you try to achieve that balance, what is your process? Yes, there is you as the director, but are you sharing it with your family members? Are you sharing it with playtesters? How does that work?
Yeah, definitely. So at this early stage, very much sharing with my family. It's been a bit of a therapy session between myself, my sister, my parents. So every now and then I'll speak to them about the project, and my father will get quite excited. He likes me making games. He doesn't play games, but he likes the idea of me making games. So he'll go and sketch out our childhood home and things. And it's been interesting with my sister, who's a few years older than me. So we've had quite a similar experience. So through the conversations with her, and both of us are parents now, that whole journey of our personal story and becoming parents, it's kind of it's massive kind of responsibility on our shoulders to tell that story for the sake of our children who are growing up British, quite completely detached from things we've gone through. So there's been a lot of conversation, family conversation for me, and also a lot of lots of articles, books, and I've tried to seek out other refugees specifically from the Middle East to try and kind of look for those parallels. And I got some really kind of hard-hitting stories about lots of specifically children who've left Iraq, even Syria, and even going back to kind of the Jewish communities have had to leave the Middle East, many years ago. So I'm drawing on parallels from different ethnicities, different groups, and trying to kind of combine that kind of diverse story just to make it more broadly appealing.
That's great. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I know you said your dad doesn't play games, but I don't know if he play tested. I had my mom play test our game once, and we were play testing with her, and it was on a mobile phone. And we were like, oh, don't worry about that. That's a bug. She goes, there's a bug on the screen. And she started freaking out. And so it's adorable to have them interact with us in that way. Cindy, same question, lived experiences and incorporating them into your game. Yes, you talked about how you reach out to almost a whole, like a gang of 10. Yeah. How do you balance those number of voices?
Yeah, I agree that it is very, very tricky, and we have a very big sense of responsibility with every interview that we do. We know that it's so important to tell these stories, and we feel like we need to make this game. The world needs to know their stories. And then at the same time, there's a lot of responsibility. The ethics are very tricky to navigate. And that's why, for example, we have reached out to Bristol University. They have a lot of resources about interactive documentaries. Mandy Rose, she's an expert, and she talks about when does collaboration become exploitation, because it's very sometimes you just take the stories and then you create the product and we're going to go on and we want to sell it and sell a lot of copies and make this incredible game, but then how do we work with our collaborators? So we are I'm going to be honest, we're still finding out the best way to do that, and we're considering how do we pay our collaborators? Do we pay them for the stories, or do we pay them for working with them? And what is a fair pay and all that? So it is still very tricky. And but then we know that we have a very honest approach to it. And for us, it's important we tell the stories. And why we are reaching out to a wide range of people, because we want to create a very a multi-perspective of the Arctic, because even for us, so we are players, we didn't know about the Arctic. When we think about the Arctic, we sometimes think about this white land in the north, that there are some polar bears on shrinking ice, but then when you read more, you see that it's home to many indigenous groups, not just Inuit, but it's the people in Norway, in Russia, in Siberia. And then it's the scientists, and then it's Russia and China coming that are investing because there's a lot of oil and resources and new shipping routes. And then we met Tanya. She is an expert on climate change and gender. And I had never thought about climate change and gender. And she talks about how women from indigenous communities are those who are suffering the most. And for us, it's as I said in the beginning, we are just creating a platform for science communication, for stories of indigenous groups to tell their stories. And it's we're thinking what is our role to be the best facilitators between these stories and our players.
Wow. Have you encountered any major challenges with this?
We have. So, for example, when we talk, it is very difficult to go to the indigenous communities because they're very skeptical. They feel very used. It's all this they feel like we go there and they're very, I don't know, exotic to us. And we just use them to bring the stories and make our project. We use indigenous communities and we use their stories. So they're very skeptical when you go talk to them. And that's why now, for example, we talked about Tomas. He's an Inuit game designer. And in our team, we have been considering how do we work with him as a game designer and not an Inuit game designer that is there just to tell an Inuit story, but he's a very talented game designer. So he's helping us with, we have some scenes where it's about strategy and it's not really about Inuit stories, but it's more, it's pure gameplay. So it's how can we work with him as a game designer and not just having this, idea that he's just representing something or a group of people. So yeah, navigating in between these and finding best ways to collaborate and incorporate them in the game.
I mean, I think that crosses into some of Florence, even as your early days as a journalist. You know, there is that question of how do you share these stories, and we have it's almost a duty to share these stories, otherwise they get lost and these voices go unheard. But that is true. Like, how do we also not exploit them? And I'd love to hear more, Florent, on this, but also just in general on lived experiences in your games.
Yeah, a small parenthesis is funny because another project by the Pixelant is called Inua, A Story in Ice and Time. And Thomas here wrote a story for us that is the backbone of the game. So yeah, very cool to see that collaborators from minorities can have several work opportunities and get paid for their talent, and not only just because they are Inuit or anything. So it's really great. Yeah, there's a main difference between being a journalist and being a game designer, because when you're a journalist, you absolutely never want to pay someone to tell you their story, because that's exactly how you get stories that are not truthful. Because once you have this economical relationship with someone that is not a professional, I mean, then you can have problems by having that person telling you what they think you want to hear. And that's why you will always hear journalists say, I will never pay for a story. And that's an ethics rule in journalism, that you should absolutely never do that. And if you are making a game, it's different, because more often than not, you're not asking only for someone's story, but you are asking for work from them. And if you are asking for work from them, then you should absolutely pay them. Obviously, it's really, really important. For instance, I'll give you an example. We worked with Dana because her story, her life story, was a basis for Bury My Love, and a very important basis for this. But if we had only asked her, can we interview you and listen to your story, we would probably not have proposed to give her money, for that very specific reason that I gave you, which is, it's always very complicated territory. If you listen to someone and you give them money just to listen to them, then you don't really know what the relationship with them is. But we also asked her for technical analysis of our writing. She read everything we wrote, line by line, and she gave us very specific advice, like a consultant that would be able to tell us, this is wrong, this is not true to reality, at least my experience, but I have still way more experience than you do, so you should probably listen to me. And this is completely believable, and this is like, this little detail is not credible. And for this part of the work, of course, we paid Dana, and we were very, very happy to do that, because she had this knowledge that was very valuable to us, and we asked her for her time and her work, so it was completely normal. Then we had a little problem, is that as she was applying for asylum in Germany, she wasn't allowed to work for money, because if she was paid by someone else, she could have lost her status. So we had to find workarounds for that. But it's also important when you ask for minorities and people who are in a very complicated situation, when you ask them for the time and you want to employ them, you also have to be very careful not to bring them more problems than actual good things. And that was very delicate. Obviously, also, you will never hear me say Dana's family name, because she has family still in Syria. And for very easy to understand reasons, that could be problematic for her if the regime knew that she was living in Germany and her family is still in Syria, her family could have problems. So yeah, you have to be very, very careful about a lot of details, and try to be as honest and faithful to what you're hearing as possible. That would be my advice on that topic.
Yeah, great. So what did happen in the end? How did you end up paying her, or was
yes, we did, but I can't go into the specifics.
No, sorry.
Because they might not be completely legal, but you know, of course we found a way to pay her, and for a time. Yeah, sure.
That was good. Well, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next topic, unless there's anything else. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but I do want to talk a little bit about building empathy in games. What kind of games do you believe work to build empathy around displacement refugees? Thinking about VR or AR or other forms, other playful interactive forms of game elements. Cindy, would you like to begin?
So I have been a gamer my whole life, and I've played a lot of games from Counter-Strike to GTA
Yeah.
and narrative games. And I'm also part of many Discord groups. And what I find it's interesting in the games industry, there the far right. There are many players that they're very young, and in Discord chats they talk about like the far right political groups, and obviously we tell many important stories through film, through magazines, through different media. But in the games industry, I feel like there's a lack of important stories, and now it's more and more. And that's why I think it's really nice to see how many creators and experimental games, but also very hugely successful games can tell important stories. And like Alba, for example, that talks about climate change, or Never Alone. And so why I love games, it's because it's a different way of interacting with stories. And in other mediums of storytelling, like film or even books, the audience is a passive participant, and in games we are active. And that, from even like a philosophical or psychoanalytical perspective, like Lacan or Zizek, they talk about how important it is to live our ways of thinking and our realities and enter a different way of interacting with reality. And games can do that. And that is why they are so powerful in creating empathy, because you can see the world through the perspective of other people. Like, for example, in Bring Me My Love, which is a very beautiful game, you can see through the eyes of a refugee, or in what we are trying to create, you are going to see it through a scientist. And games are powerful because they can take you from your place to another world, and you forget about who you are, and you can become another character and connect with the world and with the story differently. So I think that's why they're very important powerful in creating empathy.
Yeah, that immersion is so key. And yeah, Bury Me My Love. Speaking of which, Florent, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, that format of, I forgot what you call it, like it's like you're texting in real life. And
Yeah.
some of your other formats also, it's like a Twitch stream, for example. Tell us more, share more of what you think in terms of building
Yeah.
empathy.
So I think that it's really, really important to make a difference when you think about that question of empathy in games, between what you can imagine would be technical solutions that you think will immerse players in a story, and you think that automatically they would feel connected to the story. And I think it might be problematic sometimes. For instance, I've seen projects in VR that would like dump you in a refugee camp, and so you can feel from the inside that you live. And I think it's very dangerous, because you're that close to misery tourism, for instance, like just showing things that are horrible and complicated, and without context, without explanations, without the framing that is absolutely necessary for empathy to arise. This can be very, very dangerous. So I think we should never be blinded by the temptation of using technology as technology, because it would be a magical way for people to automatically connect to other people's demise and problems. I'm really wary of that, and I think it's really important to know what you are doing. And what we tried to do with Bury Me My Love was to use a device that everybody has. Nowadays, everybody has a smartphone, and all your life is in your smartphone. You text people you love and care about, but you also have your banking informations, and you also have your pictures of your kids and of your parents. And so already when you have your phone in your hands, you already are connected with some of your intimacy. And so what we tried to do with Bury Me My Love is mimic the feelings we had when we read the article from Le Monde, which was presented as a series of text messages. And as it was presented as a series of text messages, the connection was almost immediate, because you could see in the text messages that Dana was sending to her family You could see that she was using emojis, cracking jokes, and doing all the things you do all the time with your relatives and the people who are close to your art. But then 3 messages later, she was asking, should I trust this smuggler or that smuggler? Or I have no idea where I'm going to sleep tonight, or matters of life and death. And so we tried to use that, using something that everybody, like not everybody, but everybody who has a smartphone can relate to, and hijack that a little bit to tell a story that is not yours. And in Bury My Love, some people told us, but the choices that you can make, some of them I wasn't happy with. I wouldn't have done them myself, but I still kept playing, even with the frustration. And I think that's because we made a game that is not about you as a person. We want to talk to you about someone else, but we make it in a frame that can connect with you as a person. I think that empathy arises from that friction that can be reconciliated while playing the game, I would say.
Yeah, I found myself not only, you know, reflecting on the woman's journey, but also the person who was texting the husband.
Yeah.
I was like, and now I understand like all that tension he has to go through and all the stress he has to go through, and trying to go through his emotions at the same time. This is almost the inverse, but Malathi, you work in more of, you know, fully immersive installations, and I'd love to hear more on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think ultimately it is about story and narrative and people, and how we articulate that through technology just depends on the context. I mean, certainly with myself and my work at Biome Collective, we have a track record of creating, you know, digital games for Steam or whatever, but also creating kind of immersive experiences, physical installations. And I think one project maybe worth highlighting is we made a game about drone warfare called Killbox. And in Killbox, it's a very short 10-minute game. You play as a drone pilot, but then we also flip it and you also play someone on the ground. And again, quite abstracted visuals just to kind of desensitize you from quite a horrible subject matter. But in that project, you can, you know, download it on your Mac or PC, etc., and just play it. Or it lives as a kind of gallery piece. So it's been touring around the world as a kind of a 2-player experience. And what I found fascinating in that instance is that it really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, a lot of people might not consider themselves to be gamers, but they'll certainly watch someone else play. And obviously we've all found that out with YouTube and Twitch, how there's such a massive audience to people, you know, who want to watch people play. And in that project, physically being in an exhibition space and facing someone, because we designed it so that the eye line of the 2 players you can see the other person's eyes. And while you're playing as the pilot, the other person is a child on the ground, and it flips as well. And that created quite emotional moments for people. And certainly from a design point of view, it was interesting for us to witness people playing it and get emotional. But what was fascinating beyond that was that a number of people would kind of just watch 2 people play. So there'd be a third person, watch one screen, then walk to the other screen. They'd realize what was happening, and they would just wait and observe. And we took it to various contexts where, you know, there'd be a room specifically for Killbox, and within a, you know, half an hour, 20 minutes, and for the rest of the evening, there'd be just people standing around talking about drone warfare, which is not something you'd expect to talk about firstly, and not for hours, you know. So it was really interesting how that physicality of the experience brought people, you know, closer together, and they were willing to talk about subject matter is very not nice to talk about generally. So in a way, it created a safe space for conversation, because certainly the way I like to play my games is alone, when my boy's asleep, my wife's asleep, I'm by myself, huddled on the couch. And, you know, I've had wonderful experiences playing games, but, you know, I have to maybe text a friend about it or speak to my wife the next day. I kind of miss that moment to moment interaction. So yeah, there's something to be said for kind of exploring, you know, a broad spectrum of means to express your games, because I feel like, you know, with AR and VR, which, you know, are quite cool, but they're still gimmicky. They're still, you know, they can lead to that kind of, you know, just put you in someone else's shoes, and, you know, it's very visceral. It's very cheap to make something, press emotional buttons, but how you actually hold someone there for a long enough period for that information to actually soak in, for them to have a bit of reflection in their mind. That's the game of a games designer. That's the job of a games designer. And quite often we do that by slowly taking people through a story, slowly hand-holding them through something that can be quite troubling. So I think it can be cheap and gimmicky, but games designers should not say no to these things, and we should encourage more games designers to experiment with new technology, because it certainly opens up the door to new audiences. And certainly we can see from the people from the film world, they're more than happy to kind of make those those experiences that kind of can be quite tacky or in your face, but they do get audiences. And I hope we game makers get more chance to kind of explore that space.
Yeah, here, well done. I mean, you're also empowering players to speak intelligently about a topic that they may not have as much exposure to, which is amazing. I'm checking time, Marcia, but I'll go ahead and go on to the funding topic, the money topic. Basically, the status quo sources, but then also maybe innovative things that you've been thinking about and how we can fund our projects, because this is the necessary evil, or maybe this is the necessary, not even evil or good, it's just the way it is. Florent, would you like to begin?
Yes, sure. Well, I must admit, we in France are, for the moment, very lucky because we have access to public money. And I know that it's very, 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 very far from being the case in lots of other places in the world. So basically what we can do is, if we have a budget that's not that big, it's fairly easy through national, regional, and like on the departmental level, funds to get 50% of your budget funded publicly. And also we have a public broadcast channel that is called Arte, which is a French-German TV channel that has decided to recently explore the games space. And they can also co-produce games, and they are considered private actors, even though they are technically public. So if you can convince them to partner with you, which was the case for Bury My Love, ultimately for the Pixel Hunt, the investment was still a heavy investment for the size of our company, which is a very tiny company. But it was doable, which would probably not have been the case without that public support. And also it's cool because I really think that we have a lot of work to do about the perceived cultural value of video games as a medium. And the fact that you get public fundings, and the fact that you get a public TV broadcast station to help you co-produce the game, it's also part of how you grow the place, the feeling people have that games matter as a form of media and as a form of storytelling and expression. And that's really important. So that's a really privileged situation we are in France. And I would encourage anybody anywhere to try to make some lobbying to get those kind of advantages, even though I know that the general trend worldwide is more towards state disengagement, which I think is a shame. We have general elections today in France, so I'm a little like my mind is a little is in that place a little bit. We should defend public fundings for culture, of course. So yeah, I'm very privileged, and I know that.
A huge proponent of pressuring the governments to do what is good for the people. Malath, how are you getting funding, or what are some?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, public funding is without public funding, I would not be where I am today, to be honest with you. So with my project Hope, so far completely public funded, and all my past projects, the game about drone warfare, again public funded. Even a lot of experimental kind of installation based work, a lot of that has been public funded or some private investment, but primarily public funded. I think we really do have a responsibility to articulate the power of the medium of games. I think it's important that we make people realize that, quite frankly, younger audiences, that's how they perceive stories and content. So it's very accessible. And we have to lobby government wherever possible. It's been interesting for me because over the past year. I've actually joined the funding body of Creative Scotland. So I've been appointed to serve on the board, which has given me a kind of interesting perspective, the kind of national perspective of Scotland. And it's fascinating for me to kind of really understand how, other art form or art mediums, be it from craft to film, that just has such a history of lobbying and engagement in government. Whereas with games, we're still lacking in this department. We're still, a lot of us are just independently, commercially making games without necessarily collectively coming together and saying, actually, we are a sector and we have a responsibility that, quite frankly, will serve us and others. So sometimes we just focus on individual commercial entities and not the collective. And I do feel that there's space there for more kind of non-commercial entities and bodies to represent the sector as a whole in different capacities. Like, so for example, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure there's like 10, maybe 20 different groups that lobby on behalf of film in the UK alone, right? So in terms of games, we've got one or two bodies that are very specific. And I feel like we really need to up our game and engage government a lot more. And then beyond that, I think there is a conversation to be had. And we mentioned this earlier about, how do you commercialize some of this work? Because we as artists, we can't just be scared of making profit and making money. We have to make art in a way that's sustainable, that isn't kind of, commission based, and you get a bit of money, you make it, and then you're gone. You have to be able to invest in your practice, in your team, in your sector. And we have to, in that instance, we have to consider profit in an appropriate way. We can't just ignore it. And certainly I've been guilty of that. I've done lots of projects, Killbox, for example. We did that solely on a Creative Scotland grant. But since then, the project has, toured around, it's still touring around the world. And sometimes we get, a small nominal fees to exhibit the work, and sometimes we don't. But the fact that it's a digital project means that it still costs us money to run the website, to engage with people in comms and stuff, maybe do a bit of bug fixing, whatever it might be, or translation. So it's an interesting subject matter. And I feel we need more conversation in this space. And certainly, the Now Play This festival is great to have these spaces like this, to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Cindy, you are both funded through grants, but then you're exploring some, as we spoke earlier, some different forms of publishing, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes. So we are a startup. We've been doing this for 1 year, and until now we've had support from the UK Games Fund. We started with Transfuser, which is a small grant for graduates, and then after doing an initial proof of concept, you can pitch for more funding from UK Games Fund, which I would highly recommend anyone that is making games in the UK to apply for it, because it's really helpful. You get mentorship as well. And so we are at the point where in our roadmap, now we want to finish the vertical slice of the game. And then so as a startup, we're pitching to angel investors to raise money from an angel investor or a publisher. And it's interesting to be in between both, because grants are amazing. We call it free money, I guess. So it's amazing, but they can get you so far into production. And now, on one hand, with angel investors, it's really difficult to prove that narrative games can be commercially successful, because they only want to see the numbers of copies we can sell. And then to publishers, I think the conversations with them are easier because they can see the potential of narrative games and these kind of games. And there are many cases of successful games. So we are kind of in between pitching to investors and showing to them, this is how the industry works, this is how narrative games work, and then to publishers that we will pitch in September. And we talked a bit about like the kinds of publishers, because even in amidst publishers, not all of them are interested in narrative games or these kind of topics. So you have to pick. There are cases, and they can upon interactive or Eline Media, but even there you have to pick. And yeah.
And also Apple Arcade and Netflix. So think big, go for it. Highly encourage that. We're on our final topic, and given that we're kind of low on time, I do want to maybe just at least get everyone to share. Wait, I can't find the time. A bit on just innovation in narrative and in action. Just the stories of displacement we're not seeing in games yet. What other 10 minutes? Okay. Narratives can we explore that have value outside of understanding what the necessary and dangerous journeys people take to escape violence, repression, or are there other opportunities? How can we diversify what it means to be a refugee through games? Thinking about refugees as citizens, knowledge holders, neighbors, superheroes. Is there room for characters that happen to be refugees in already existing games, etc.? Yeah. Who would like to begin? I'm leaving this open. Perhaps you had some time to think about this and have some cool ideas to share. I mean, I know Florent, you were also exploring this in game, but yes, please start.
Yeah, I can start. I think I will speak from my point of view. Even though my family has a relationship with the migrations and asylum seeking, I am not directly in this situation. And I think that is very important. Once you have, like, the way I see it is, once you have participated in giving migrants and refugees a platform, and that's what we did with Perimela, I think the next step is for the ones among them who want to actually be able to tell their stories themselves. And I think it's really, really important. And I think that's one of the reasons why I loved Path Out so much, is that because Abdullah was part of the creation, as was Dana, but Abdullah was actually, he wants to be a game designer, he wants to work in video games. So it was actually an open door for him to have something to show for himself and to build a career, which was not the case for Dana. Dana doesn't care about video games. So she was really happy to help us and consult with us, but that didn't actually help her have a better life in Germany, not know that she's settled in Germany. So I think that's the ideally, telling one's story is the very best thing you can do to empower people and to be, for them to be able to just like show who they are and share it with the world, and probably help foster like a brotherhood, basically. And that's really important. And I think that Malath is a great example of that. I think you are a first generation immigrant, and the fact that you are able to tell your story through games, we want definitely more of that. So we with the associations in France, we try to work towards empowering people who would not even consider making a career in games, so that they feel they belong and they feel they are able to, and so that they can tell their own personal stories that don't necessarily have to do with the newsworthy part of the experience of being a refugee, but with all the rest and all the more intimate parts.
And good mention of Malath there, perhaps take it on.
Yeah, thank you. No, very nice of you to say that, Florent. I think certainly my take on that is that, though I'm glad I'm getting to tell the story, it's also like, 30 years in the making. And I feel like that there's stories happening right now and stories to be told. And I feel like I want to empower people to tell those stories in the moment, rather than have to wait to get 30 years of kind of having a Western lens, quite frankly, because I do have that Western lens now. I think my take on that is that the world is so incredibly rich and diverse, and we're only getting things through particular lenses, through that Western lens, which I'm part of. And I just feel like we all deserve better than that. That globally we deserve better than that. Just the fact that, people will make massive assumptions when they know I'm from Iraq. They will assume I'm a particular ethnicity or religion. Quite often they're wrong, because, we're not all X, Y, or Z. And that often makes me very sad, because people don't know those intricate details, which I don't think are that difficult to learn about or figure out. And obviously every area of land across the world, there's a country that has boundaries, it has different groups of people, ethnicities, religions, all sorts of things. And I just feel like we owe it to those different identities and groups that we represent them much better globally. And I just feel like there's so much work to do in that area, that I feel like it's almost like it's hard enough to make experimental games in the West, be it in France or the UK or whatever. Thankfully, we have these public bodies to support us. But there's even more stories to be that aren't being told, that there's no one supporting those people, you know? So I would love to kind of almost work towards a games publisher of sorts that seeks out these stories, because quite frankly, these are universal stories and they can be commercialized, not in a horrible way. They can be commercialized in a sustainable way to help the individuals get the stories across. So I'd love to be part of that somehow. You know, I've had the privilege to travel to places like Indonesia or Ukraine, South Africa, all sorts of cool places as part of being a games maker. And I've always come across really interesting people, ethnicities, groups. And I just wish we could kind of more broadly represent them, quite frankly.
Yeah, agreed. I was talking to Marcia earlier about Luan Mayen. I was on a panel with him back on GDC. So he lived in a refugee camp for about 25 years. And now he has a foundation where he's training or he's teaching and educating children in refugee camps on how to make games. I think that's amazing because then, it's not their Western lens, it's their own personal lens. And I'd love to see what comes out of that. Cindy, you.
So I started making Dictatura first, which is the story of the Albanian dictatorship. I'm Albanian, and for me, it was the story that I always wanted to tell. And then when we started interviewing people that live and work in the Arctic, and we decided to stop Dictatura and focus on Race for the Arctic because the Arctic is the tipping point, and we only have 3 years to reverse climate change. And for us, so when it was really empowering to talk with Inuit communities, because like I didn't know anything about it, and I assumed, and maybe it is the wrong assumption, but I want to believe maybe it is not the wrong assumption, that maybe the general player or the general public doesn't know a lot about what is happening in the Arctic. And for example, we talked with Richard, he's a family medicine professor, and he talked about how there is suicide is rising among Inuit communities in Canada. There is diabetes, and these are things that we don't know anything about. So it was important that I felt like in our team, we have the privilege to have the creative skills, to have access to funding, to have access to publishers. So how do we use our skills and privilege to give a platform to these stories that really need to be told, and to these stories that maybe we won't hear on the media. They don't make it, they're not like newsworthy, or they are not, we don't see on films. And it's just like, how can we use our skills to create a platform, and also to create a relationship with our collaborators. So for example, with Roberto, who is the professor of green shipping, we had an interview and then we had a workshop, and then he invited us to use games with his students in the university in Norway to talk about green shipping and the impact of shipping, and even green shipping, like what is in it, and like how is it being used, how is it being implemented. So there is interest even in academia. Like when we talked with him the first time, he said, I only have 40 minutes to talk about my topic for your game. And now we've had 3 more meetings, and he is inviting us to go to Norway to use games as a medium to deal with this topic. So it's very interesting to see. Games are not just entertainment. Games can tell stories, games can create workshops, they can be used for lectures. So it's interesting, how can we use our tools for different ways?
That's beautiful. Let's end with that. Thank you so much, Cindy. Thank you, Florent. Thank you, Malath, for talking with us today. Shall we move on to the Q&A portion? Hopefully we have some questions in the audience as well as on Twitch. Or sorry, on the chat. I don't know what that chat. I get so addicted to those little red numbers. What do I throw the microphone in? Okay, well, it's okay. It's a little
Hi, my name is Mahmoud Mahdi. I'm an Egyptian Scottish filmmaker and a member of Blackbird Collective. Obviously, this discussion's been really, really interesting. But I've just got a very quick, well, I'll try to make it as succinct as possible. But my question is to do with a lot with representation in terms of migration, because there seems to be a discourse that there needs to be kind of physical representation of migration stories, whilst I feel that there's a lot of underrepresentation in terms of the imagination and the imaginary behind migration. And I think part of it comes from the idea that it's looked at from the Western lens as a modern problem which needs to be solved, and then it becomes like a political discourse, a political debate that people must have, where we need migration or there is a limit to it. But interestingly enough, I feel that when it comes to the collective imagination of migrants or migration, that seems to not have a space to kind of occupy or to even have discourse. And I guess I don't directly come from a kind of typical kind of migration background, but from my experience living in Egypt and my experience of like political trauma is that in here in the West, there's a situation where political trauma must assume some form of political discourse. But actually there's a very strong connection between political trauma and imagination. And that actually involves this very interesting agency of like, of healing, or even being able to find other kind of discourses in terms of being able to tell that kind of story. So I guess my question to Mara Habes and Florent and yourself also is that, you know, is there perhaps maybe there's a direction to see the imagination as a battlefront also, not just the political and social and empirical world that we have to compete with in terms of the system, but maybe what we can imagine, because I feel like computer games and games generally have that opportunity where we could actually open up this kind of space for imagination and collective imagination. So, yeah.
Happy to jump in there. I think it's a games designer's responsibility to get the audience so far, to get them to a particular space where they then need to kind of have a sense of agency and ownership and to explore things using their imagination. So I think I strongly agree with you. I think because sometimes if it's very much about, if we're being reductive and it's about X, Y, or Z, well, the X, Y, or Z is very specific to you as an individual. And I think sometimes there's bigger things at play, and we can make things more universal if we create artwork that leaves space for the audience to kind of participate, have a sense of ownership, and be able to almost like direct it to a certain extent. And I think games really can empower you to do that. I think that's really important. So absolutely, I agree with you. I think that the imagination is a great space that we need to explore as game makers in particular, more than any other art forms.
Yeah, I agree with you completely as well. And that is the struggle when you move to interactive media and games, maybe when you haven't studied game design before, like from my experience, you always want to make something that is linear and the player just goes and explores the story. And now, for example, we are playing with time. So our game is in imagination across time, and it's the next 50 years in the Arctic. That the beauty of that is that we can play with speculative design. And in our team, the creative decisions we're taking is that how do we build a world that the player wants to explore and go around and then make up their own story, rather than giving the story to them as like, because that is a film, that is not actually a game. And so we are playing more with like having an adventure or an exploratory experience rather than a narrative game. So yeah, that's why we're playing with fiction, with time, and yeah.
Maybe just to elaborate a little bit on that, I think it's very hard to face the conclusion that Western colonialism has been widespread in every aspect of society, and imagination is one of them. And I say that as a product of this culture. I am very torn apart, because on one hand, there are so many things that are still completely unexplored and unsaid in video games as a field. And I want to say so much and make so many projects about that. But on the other hand, the Western culture is already so present and has already swerved video games as a medium in a direction that is frankly often despicable, like lots of propaganda in games, lots of games based on conflict and war and domination and exploitation of resources, things that are very, very common in the West in general. And so sometimes I feel like we should just shut up and leave the place to other cultures and other imaginations. And that feels a little bit uncomfortable because I want to make games, but yeah, we are at a crossroad, and it's also important for us to help other people with other perceptions of the world tell stories that are different in every kind of medium, including, of course, games. Yeah, and imagination should not be shaped by Western culture only, of course.
Yeah, and thank you for using your privilege for good. Any other questions from the audience? Ben? I know you.
Yeah, I'm just, my name's Ben. I'm a social impact advisor for campaigns for film and games. So I'm curious what you all think in terms of how much focus is put in these narratives on the second half of these people's journey in whatever kind of migration is taking place. So a lot of what we hear is the danger that people are exiting from, and less about that danger really still resides much in the new places that they end up. Florent, you had a great example. Just being able to even hire someone was a very delicate situation. And I think those are things most people don't know about. And so I'm curious what you all think in terms of that part of the conversation and how much we can focus on that.
Go ahead, Florent, you go first.
No, I just wanted to say, I think we already touched on that a little bit. I think in like the experience of what it means to live in a specific situation in the country that is emitting the media should be told by the people who are directly concerned by those stories. So I think it's what I envision is workshops, it's actions, it's I love your idea about having a publisher that would really want to work in that field. We need the money though, but money can be found. Money can be found. So I really think, yeah, that's the thing. That's voicing those people. Like getting asylum in a democracy that prides itself of being a democracy should come with accessing those privileges too, I think.
I was going to just jump in and say that, you know, that there's a reason why I call my project Hope, because I feel like, you know, I whenever I talk about the project, I talk about all the kind of horrible things that have happened to me in my kind of upbringing coming to the West. There's lots of horrible things. However, you know, I have an incredibly happy childhood memories of growing up in Iraq. Even though at the time there was the war between Iran and Iraq, I had a very happy childhood. 99% of my memories of growing up in Iraq are very super positive and happy. And that's one of the challenges I've had, is I've grown up with a particular version of Iraq portrayed on the media. That's war, terrorism, all this kind of stuff, which, you know, was also true, but it never fully gave you the full picture that these are human beings on the ground, mothers, fathers, children, parents, people that we could relate to, that were never, you know, the media never made these people relatable, right? And that's why you can see with the horrors that's happening right now in Ukraine, how there's been this kind of clear public compassion, as there should be for people in the Ukraine. But there's me thinking, well, where was this when, you know, there were brown people, and there's still brown people around the world who are suffering? You know, where's the compassion there? So that's certainly something I want to bring to the table, that, you know, we should really have compassion for humanity. And I feel you only do that, I can only do that by actually showing people that I had a very happy, relatable childhood in Iraq. And I hope by telling that story, it kind of evens out in a way that makes the trauma, quite frankly, palatable, you know, so more people understand, I hope.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tomo. I'm a designer and developer from Japan, and I joined the design camp this week, and I'm also actually exhibiting the AI bouncer over there in the hall. So if you want to play that, that'd be cool. One question I had was around abstraction. So during the design camp, Dan from ustwo Games did like a quick lecture, and one thing that really touched me was how he said to us that when like dealing with social problems in games, you need to have like layers of abstraction, and otherwise, if it's too literal, you have this problem of only like preaching to the converted. And I feel like this is especially true in like East Asian context where I'm from, where it's actually really difficult to talk about political problems directly in a content. And people, if you do that, people will be like, okay, that's for arts, and nobody would touch it. So you really need to kind of fictionalize it. My question was, what kind of things do you do as like a marketing or communication strategy to make sure that like there's enough level of abstraction to kind of reach to broader audiences outside of the people who are already concerned about like the problem like you want to touch upon?
Hard questions.
I can start again, no problem. I think this has been a common theme in a lot of my work, trying to kind of use abstraction as a mechanism to make things more accessible, appealing. I think it's important that we bring people in. I think it's important that we have a open door policy to these experiences that we create. And abstraction is just not only a tool of trickery to get people in, I think it's just a great tool to create a safe space. So we created a project called Spiel, which was an interactive installation at Somerset House, actually, for the London Design Biennale 2018. And for that project, we were dealing with mental health as the kind of subject matter. And what was really interesting for us was when we engaged with youth workers who were quite normally on the forefront of mental health for young people, they taught us a technique whereby they would simply bring out kind of deck of cards with abstract visuals on them, and they would use that to start a conversation about the young person's mental health. And so we used that mechanism, and we created a bunch of abstracted visuals to represent different emotional states. And there was joy, there was anger, there was all these kind of abstracted sonic and visual things that would be, you walk into a space and be fully immersed in this kind of rainbow of different visuals. And what was really interesting is because as designers, we put a lot of thought into each one of those 8 interactions. The people would firstly find it quite fun and engaging, but the more time they spent there, the more they felt empowered to kind of articulate their feelings and emotions. So I think that's that's the cool thing about abstraction. Not only is it a mechanism to bring people in, it's a great way to keep them there. And I feel for subject matter like this, you need to keep people there. You need to make people actually make sure they actually care and are connected to subject matter. So abstraction is a very, very powerful tool for human communication. We all need it, quite frankly. We all use it in different ways. So it's a great tool for game makers.
All right. And with that, unless there's any final, well, ask us afterwards. We'll have more we'll be around. We want to thank the Now Play This Festival team for hosting us today at Somerset House, as well as managing all the tech behind the scenes. I'd like to especially thank Marsha Chandra and the rest of the Counterpoints Arts team for their tireless energy, support, and curation on this important topic. And thanks to the panelists again for their amazing contributions. This discussion has been produced by the Counterpoints Arts as part of its PopChange Salon series. If you're interested in talking more about this topic or collaborating around gaming, especially the upcoming Game Jam, it's exciting, that Counterpoints is organizing, please get in touch via their website, www.counterpointarts.org.uk. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.